Before I start with the analysis of the poem, I will briefly discuss the context of the period, as this will really help you further understand the ideas that Dawe is trying to convey in this poem. Now, we know up until this point in Australia's history, they've had a pretty horrific existence throughout the 20th century. Hardships and devastation really were a constant during this time period. World War I, followed by the Depression, followed by World War II. So by the time the 1950s rolled around, Australians were pretty desperate for some positive influences and things to happen in their life. And they were really lucky that they experienced these things successfully in a number of ways, largely through technology. So, introduction of household appliances, television, the motor car. People also experienced greater freedoms in their daily lives. Now that the war was over, there was more jobs and, changes in gender roles happened as a result. And largely this was a time for experimentation that really came in the form of popular culture. So there was heavy influences from America in terms of fashion, movies and music. So this really can be kind of summarised as ultimately an opportunity for Australians to better their lives. However, Dawe even though he acknowledges these aspects, he explores them in a way that he particularly emphasises the fact that both media and advertising at this time really took advantage of people and their want and desire for change. So they really promoted these ideas of consumerism and like this sort of self-centered behaviour of how many things we can acquire and what we can do materialistically to better our lives rather than just be good people. In terms of the structure, the poem, very similarly to weapons training, is a monologue. So it's really roughly divided into 9 sections that represent the life cycle, and in particular the persona's life cycle from life starting at birth up until death. So even though it kind of follows this narrative structure, it's not really chronological nor autobiographical, because Dawe's commentary about advertising and media, with its messages are put in there, and also there's snippets of conversation concerning the persona in his relationships. Now, in terms of the actual poem, the title itself, Enter Without So Much as Knocking, is in fact an idiom and is used in variation to the sign we often see in office doors, that knock and enter. So Dawe here, ironically, is describing someone who is quite brash and rude and actually comes without welcome into a person's home or perhaps, a private space. And in this case, he's really referring to the persona, which at this point is only a baby. So he implies that the baby is entering quite an organised and regulated society in a very irregular manner, to the extent that the baby doesn't even bother to knock as it enters. And therefore, he doesn't actually respond to any sort of conformities in society at this time, and probably to the extent that he doesn't even, obey the signs that he begins to see about hospital and particularly silence. Now, Dawe here has used an epigraph as the subtitle of this poem. If you're not sure what an epigraph is, it's simply an inscription on an object. So often this was found in the ancient world on, coins, buildings, tablets, those sorts of things. So here Dawe chooses a Latin epigraph, which we know is the language of the early church, and he's actually alerting us here to the Bible's teaching found in Genesis in chapter 3, verse 19. And this verse actually reads in its fullest form, "By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return." So although we often see this passage in funeral services, Dawe uses it to really build the foundation of his poem and its real central idea, the fact that humans are mortal, and this is really the determining factor in our lives. When we begin at birth up until our death, no matter how many material goods, we try to acquire during this time period, we can't really avoid this fundamental truth, the fact that we are in fact mortal, and the things that are important in our lives come back to this idea. Now, the poem itself opens with this onomatopoeia of the blink blink. Now, as an audience, we're not particularly sure what this alludes to. There's multiple things. Perhaps it's the indicator on the car as it, turns into the hospital grounds to, get this pregnant woman to a hospital. It could also be the newborn baby itself, who is, blinking as its eyes kind of adjust the lights as it's, born into the world. Or perhaps it's often associated with that whole idea of passage of time, the fact that, things happen in the blink of an eyelid. So regardless of the interpretation there, it all comes back to the fact that there's a sense of urgency. And, we see that in Dawe's criticism immediately in this opening line. He is criticising society in the sense that as soon as this baby is born, it's already exposed to regulations and conformity in society. And we see that through these two signs here of hospital and silence. We then fast forward to the fact that, this baby is then taken home at 10 days old. And as it enters the home, the first thing it actually hears is the television. And here, Dawe, possesses a strong view of the fact that television has such a huge impact on our daily lives, to the extent that there's no conversation between people. Their only medium of communication is through television, and this is where we get such heavy influences of greed and, wanting to acquire goods through the television. So he emphasises the fact that this is really the first communication the baby experiences, not that of his parents. So Dawe further explores this idea from using the satire of Bobby Dazzler on Channel 7. Now, during this time in society, television has just been introduced, so lots of new ideas there, particularly quiz shows. And Bobby Dazzler is a satire of a game show that was popular called Pick a Box. And, he uses this term dazzler as a colloquial expression. It often refers to someone or something that's, quite fantastic, that they'd dazzle you with, their sort of brilliance here. And in this case, he's talking about the cash and prizes are quite dazzling. So he further goes on to say that through almost a patronising phrase that you often hear on these game shows of, hello, you lucky people. So he's kind of suggesting that the audience here may be lucky enough to win some of these cash and prizes, and therefore that ultimately leads to, a happiness through the goods that you've acquired here. So yet interestingly, he ends the stanza with this sort of dry humour here by saying that the baby is really the only lucky one, because the baby can't understand, the media mixed messages and slogans that are being said, and he can't certainly read what's written on the television screen. So therefore, he's not really influenced by these mediums, whether it be, the television here or the hospital signs. He's not influenced by slogans and consumerism yet. However, given a year or two, as it says in the next stanza, he, things change quite quickly. Dawe opens with these cliches of, settle in and get acquainted. And it really uses to kind of emphasise that these families are heavily conditioned into the way that they operate, and describes them, in these cliche manners, that they're, set up like every other well-equipped, smoothly run household. And I think it's interesting in the sort of diction that he uses here, because, we know this whole idea that a house is not a home, and he's kind of showing the fact that this upbringing is very typical. It's like every other. The fact that everyone sort of conforms to being the same and, respond to these same advertising campaigns and other conditioning factors that promote, needing to have the latest, household goods here. So it's interesting because he's kind of commenting on the fact that there's, this absence of informed choices, whether that be through parents or authority that are perhaps warning you against acquiring all these things. How many different types of household items do you actually need? And at no point do we sort of see an authority figure that is warning of these dangers of, sort of succumbing to temptations through the media. Now, Dawe goes on to describe the family that's within this home environment, and he does this through the colloquial expressions of, mum, dad and kids here. And we know these are slang terms for the family unit, yet Dawe sort of challenges these by reducing them to represent a distinct niche market. The fact that, you know, the mother in itself is one economy-sized mum is really describing the way that she looks here. The fact that this mother is an excessive size, you know, to be comparable to that of a washing machine or fridge. So shows that she's obviously someone who has succumbed to the pressures of advertising and, you know, to the extent that she has become overweight. Now, the father in itself, he's described by this notion of the suit. This Anthony Squires, a company that produces this quite specific and elaborate style suit that, you know, is Coolstream and summer weight. So it's kind of showing that the father's worth here is only as good as his suit, and that these particular suits are the best kind of ones that you can sort of get on the market here. Finally, the kids, the other two children, we know that the baby, or, you know, the persona in this poem, it's showing that they have two other siblings here, but Dawe sort of juxtaposes them to being like goods found in a department store. You know, this whole idea that, you know, humans are categorized and exploited through marketing opportunities, so much so that, you know, they're the same. All of these siblings look exactly the same. The clothes they wear are the same. And as a result, on a wider community base, we conform to these peer pressures and stereotypes that force us to not necessarily relate to people in a meaningful way. It's rather the fact that, you know, people are conforming to this one particular look and this one particular attitude and one particular set of values. So Dawe's really underpinning the idea that our relationships are based on business transactions. It's what you can get from others, what influences they have upon you. We don't actually have relationships for the sake of being meaningful and, you know, wanting to establish friendships because people are simply good people. So here he's really using a hyperbole to exaggerate how dehumanized people become right from the get-go, from when they're born. So he's really showing that this persona is really indoctrinated into such an impersonal way of life. The next stanza really talks about how, again, the mother portrays this particular role as not someone who likes documentary films or watches the news, but someone who is interested in quiz shows, and in this case, actually wins a quiz show. So it talks about the consequences here that she then takes her baby to get this advertising slogan style pram, you know, a good as new station wagon. So the comparison here of a car, this pram is so elaborate it can be compared to, you know, a car. And this is what she has done with the money. You know, doesn't use it perhaps to invest or you know, pay off her mortgage or anything like that. Straight away goes and buys this, you know, top of the range pram for, as it says, £495 at this department store called Reno's. And just so you know, it's only written in British pound because the Australian dollar wasn't introduced until 1966. So that's not a typo there. That's actually the currency Australians used at this time. So again, kind of emphasising how brash people are in their decision making. They don't think about when they gain money, they don't think about what they're going to do with it. It's just about spending it as soon as they get it. Now, the second part of this stanza really presents two particular images that are quite negative aspects of modern society. The first of which is the use of signs, like we had in the first stanza. So you see these sort of, you know, shouty capitals here reflecting people don't really have a freedom of choice here, and that they're so heavily restricted by a world that is highly controlled and regulated by these sorts of rules. You know, walk, don't walk, turn left, no parking, wait here. You know, all these things that are trying to achieve compliance by people on some level. So, you know, the signs show that in this case, the persona needs to abide by these regulations, and, you know, it's informing him of the sort of person and their social expectations that are going to be placed upon him. And you kind of get the feeling that Dawe really is suggesting that there's little alternative to this type of person, that everyone in society is this sort of man, and, you know, someone that experiences, you know, a hectic pace and city noise and traffic jams and stress and tension and all these sorts of things that we've kind of brought on ourselves as a result of, issues to do with commercialization and, bureaucracy. But I quite appreciate the fact here that Dawe, in the middle of this stanza, satirically adds this sign here in particular: no breathing except by order. So, he jokingly suggests here that authorities set up signs for every single thing, that, they're assuming here that people are not capable of being able to do things, whether it makes decisions or acting responsibly on their own part, and certainly that they're not willing. So, he implies that by having these signs for all of these things, they're taking away people's rights to decide for themselves in terms of what they should or shouldn't do within their own lives. The second part of this stanza is certainly something that you will all be able to relate to as well, in the sense of having traffic that, gives you this kind of claustrophobic feeling. And Dawe does this quite well through the short and sharp, jerky sentences. Okay, you can imagine the car manoeuvring in and out of the traffic, as we see him commenting about the issues with the traffic. So it's here that we kind of realise, up until this point, we see no pleasure in this man's life whatsoever. So Dawe really does that by capturing the noises of the traffic through the onomatopoeia of the beeps, but also the things that come alongside that, the gestures of beeping on the horn, and also particular this last part, emphasising the frustration vocally through, offensive language here. So, Dawe uses both of these images to present a reflection for the audience. Is this the way that we want our society to be? Is this the sorts of experiences that we need in our lives? Now, this next stanza is the only time in the poem that we see, as it says here, the enjoyment. The fact that the baby from toddler is now a little boy, goes to the local drive-in, okay, and he actually describes here his experience, this clear night when he sees, a movie on a 50-foot screen. So he's describing, his experience here, but for him, it's not actually the movie that he enjoys. He doesn't really enjoy the film because he doesn't understand what's happening. As it says here, where giant faces forever snarled and screamed or make incomprehensible and monstrous love. Here Dawe uses a lot of diction to show that he doesn't understand what the people making love in the film were doing. He actually sees it as a source of fear and pleasure. So, these words of, snarled and screamed and incomprehensible and certainly monstrous. So he finds the film itself quite confronting, but as he says, it's not actually the film that he enjoys. He sees beyond that. He sees beyond the movie screen. He sees a pure, unadulterated fringe of sky littered with stars. So this is really the fact that this is the only thing that he sees in his life that is quite pure and beautiful and is not been spoiled by society yet. And Dawe further expands that when it says no one had got around to fixing it up yet. So no one has really, manipulated his mind enough to the fact that he actually can realise for a moment that there are beautiful things in the world, and certainly beautiful things that are, beyond materialism here. So he emphasises the fact that the innocence of children at this point are the only time that people are not corrupted by media and advertising. Now, the next stanza uses cliches again to sort of express the persona's ideas and attitudes about how his peers, relationships he has in the world have formed what his idea of the world is. So the idea of, as it says, pretty soon, Dawe sort of tells us that there are social pressures which kind of mould people until they and everyone else become this idea of what is realistic. So you actually see him quickly transition from a child to an adult that becomes very much so like everyone else. As he suggests here, he uses accumulation to suggest the sorts of people that are realistic, godless, money hungry, backstabbing, and, ends with the euphemism here of a miserable so-and-so. So again, saying that this is sort of normal. These are the people that exist in our society. Everyone's money hungry. Everyone is kind of, out for themselves. And even though he uses this mournful tone to follow of this sentence, goodbye the stars and the soft cry in the corner when no one was looking, he has leapt to this aggressive ideology. Unquestionably, he promotes this kind of ruthless idea, as it further says here, number one every time. So this idea of, only looking out for himself. So, and also not thinking about how that actually impacts on others, this idea of being, totally self-centered. And the fact that he actually boasts about it to his friend Jim is, quite concerning here. So this attitude is further emphasized in his behaviors of abuse, both physically and mentally. This kicking whoever's down and hit wherever you see ahead, like this aggressive, outlandish behavior. And also here, Claire is in fact his friend Jim's wife, and he sort of treats her badly by just thanking her for this lovely evening, and sort of is someone that takes from other people but really gives them nothing in return. And he sort of as he ends this stanza, he closes with this cliche question that's confusing. When he says, "You know what I mean," it shows that his life actually lacks meaning. The fact that he says, "I mean, it's a real battle all the way and the man can't help feel sorry for himself. You know what I mean?" This repetition of the meaning and the closed cliche question kind of shows this is exactly what is absent from this man's life. He has no meaning to his life. He doesn't know why he's here and what he's doing, and he can't fully articulate that. So and this is really summed up beautifully in this next stanza when we see this sort of sense of panic in this accident. The dialogue here shows that their relationship is out of control. He's basically ranting and yelling at his wife, sort of justifying his actions. And the dialogue shows not only is their relationship out of the control, but that's also mirrored in the movement of the car. That Claire, bringing up Claire Jessup has obviously caused issues for his wife Alice, and she's upset, and for whatever reason he's obviously gone to Claire and got things that perhaps his wife couldn't provide him. And this is really his biggest mistake. He brings up these issues in a car with someone that's obviously an emotional driver, and you're not going to get your wife to settle down, revealing to her that you've had a night with some other woman. So he's ultimately brought his demise here by, being bad-tempered and swearing at his wife. And we see by the dashes here, the punctuation of the dashes, that she's ultimately lost control of the car and, is representative of his death here. So it's interesting that Dawe almost represents that it was quite a simplistic accident. There was no sort of mourning to it, and there was no sort of death. It's quite final, and we see this in the next stanza with these kind of colloquialisms to bring in this light-hearted tone, because we know that death is quite a final and emotional thing. And here he brings in this irony by calling the funeral company, Pribity and Sons, that this actually means honesty, and this is exactly what the company was not, and certainly what the persona of the poem wasn't. And, this use of morticians here is a euphemism for older euphemisms we had in the funeral world. So, funeral directors, undertakers, these sorts of people that all kind of dance around the idea of, dead, and focusing on the process of funerals rather than the body itself, because we know that generally speaking about death and dead bodies is not a particularly nice thing. So, he uses the irony and the repetition throughout this stanza to, kind of satire his demise. The fact that he had a healthy tan, that he never had. So in real life, he never actually looked like this, but in death, they're showing their skill as undertakers, that they can, artificially create someone for the benefit of a burial show, not only in just the way that they look, but also we know this man was quite unethical and dishonest, and they make him look like this, fabulous, preserved, respectable human being. So it's, this, we see through these lines here, particularly an old automatic smile with nothing behind it, that it's pretty much the ultimate sham. They've preserved a man and represent a man that looks and was nothing like what he was in real life. So, further on, it sort of accumulates toward the end here, the benefits and advantages of living in, permanent residential areas, that it's a nice ride to the underground. There's no parking tickets, no taxi meters, no Bobby Dazzlers. Again, Dawe mentions these things in contrast with the fact that what's not said here, there's no sorrow or mourning of the death of this individual. Death is so much about leaving loved ones behind and being concerned for the welfare. But because this man never felt these things for other people, now that he's dead, no one actually grieves for him. So Dawe is really taking, the reverse stance here. And we see, the finality of the poem shows this cyclical nature and structure of the poem. The fact that, we end with the blink, blink and the silence, but instead of, the hospital, it's suggesting the turning of the hearse into the cemetery. So, and again, the silence this time is not a command, but a condition. The fact that this man has lived his life accepting, patterns imposed by, pressures of society and conformity, that the silence around the grave is really the result of him being such an empty individual, and the fact that he lived an empty life where he put nothing into it, and, no one is crying to mourn the loss of his life.